Those raised beds are in violation of community aesthetic standards, Mr. Calhoun, and they need to come down by the end of the month, or we will begin assessing daily fines. That was Denise Hartwell, president of the Crest Hollow Homeowners Association, standing at the edge of my vegetable rows in a cream linen blazer and espadrilles that had never touched actual soil in their lives. She held a laminated copy of the CCNRS like a citation pad, and the gold HOA lanyard around her neck caught the morning light. Behind her, her assistant, a young woman in an HOA polo shirt, clutched a clipboard and stared at the tomato cages like they were evidence at a crime scene. My blue heeler, Pepper, sat at my boot and watched the pair of them with more skepticism than I allowed myself to show. I had been staking the first row of peonies when they walked up the drive, and I took my time finishing the stake before I turned around. Denise swept one arm along the row of beds and said, "This is a residential community, Mr. Calhoun. We have standards that protect everyone's property values, and frankly, this operation has been an eyesore since I took office." The assistant wrote something on the clipboard. I looked at the beds, 11 of them in 2 rows, cedar planked and clean-edged, the ranunculus just beginning to show color at the far end. They were not an eyesore. They were a farm. I said I would look into it, and I meant that I already had. What Denise did not know, standing there in her espadrilles on my father's soil, was that I had already spent an afternoon with the 1971 deed to this parcel. And the word she needed to understand was agricultural, because that word had been stamped into the county record 23 years before Crest Hollow's founding documents ever saw a notary's pen. I want to ask you something right now, and I mean it sincerely. If somebody walked onto land your family had worked for 50 years, waved a laminated sheet at you, and told you your livelihood violated their aesthetic standards, what would you do? Drop your answer below. Stick around, because the story does not end with a notice. It ends with the flowers. My name is Ray Calhoun. I was 56 years old when this started. I had been running a specialty cut flower and market garden operation on a 3.2-acre parcel in the western corner of what was now Crest Hollow Estates for going on 18 years. Before that, my father, Ray Sr., had worked the same ground since 1971. Growing sweet corn, pumpkins, and late-season chrysanthemums he sold at the county fair and a handful of local florists. He was not a wealthy man, but he was a deliberate one. When he retired from the county assessor's office after 22 years, he came back to the parcel and farmed it in the serious way he had always wanted to. He built the greenhouse bays one at a time over 3 summers. Pouring the footings himself and framing the walls with lumber he milled from a stand of cedar he had thinned from the back of the property. He built the first raised beds from the same cedar, 12 of them eventually, lined up in 2 rows on the south-facing slope, where they would catch the full morning sun. When he passed, he left me the parcel, the walk-in cooler, the 4-bay greenhouse, and the state nursery grower's license I had kept current without a single lapse. He also left me the documentation habit. He kept a metal filing cabinet in the barn, and every drawer was labeled. Tax records, county correspondence, contracts, deed copies, license renewals, surveyor reports. He taught me that paper is the only thing that does not change its story after the fact. I took that lesson seriously. By the time Denise Hartwell showed up at my gate, I kept 2 filing cabinets, plus a backup drive in the walk-in office, plus a second backup drive at my brother's house in town. My son Cody was 16 that spring. He had been living with me full-time since his mother and I divorced 4 years prior. And he worked the farm most mornings before school and every Saturday, running the irrigation line and helping me bundle the weekly cut flower orders for the restaurants downtown and the 2 florists I supplied on standing contract. He was good at it and didn't make a production of being good at it. He had my father's eye for which stems were ready and which needed another day. Some mornings he would get to the greenhouse before me, and I would find him already grading the ranunculus. Radio on low, pepper stretched across the doorway. That was the picture I was trying to protect. Not the money, though we needed it. The picture itself. Crest Hollow had been built in 3 phases between 1994 and 2001, swallowing a former horse property and 2 hobby farms that adjoined my father's land on the north and east sides. When the first phase broke ground, my father had a surveyor walk the entire boundary and file a corrected plat with the county. And he pulled the 1971 deed and had an attorney write a 1-page memo confirming the parcel's standing as agricultural commercial use under state law, predating the HOA's CC&Rs by 23 years. He put the memo in the cabinet next to the deed. I found both of them the same afternoon I pulled the cabinet open, the week after Denise's first visit. They were in a folder my father had labeled, in his careful block printing, for when this happens. He had not been wrong that it would. Denise had been HOA president for 7 years by the time she showed up at my gate. She had run 3 times unopposed and had redone the community entrance plantings twice, always with the same contractor, a landscaping company called Bright Borders that held the annual beautification contract for every common area bed in Crest Hollow. I did not know yet who owned Bright Borders or what the payment arrangement looked like. I would learn both of those things later, and the learning would change everything. What I knew that first morning was that my parcel was not subject to the CC&Rs, that my grower's license predated her organization's founding, and that I was not going to give an inch. I did not say any of that to her. I said, "I'll look into it." And I went back to tying dahlias. She sent the first formal compliance notice 7 days later. It cited 3 specific provisions of the CC&RS covering structure height, commercial signage, and what the document called incompatible agricultural activity. I read all 3 provisions carefully. My raised beds were 22 inches tall. My sign at the road was a flat cedar board with my name and a phone number, 12 inches by 18 inches, well within county commercial signage limits. And the 3rd provision was the one that told me everything I needed to know about how well Denise had done her homework, because the CC&Rs explicitly carved out existing agricultural use parcels from the commercial activity restriction. She had either not read her own documents or not read mine. Probably both. I filed the notice in a manila folder labeled with the date and the case number she had assigned it. Then I sat at the kitchen table and wrote a 3-sentence letter on plain paper. It said I had reviewed the cited provisions, that the parcel had carried an agricultural commercial use designation since April 14th, 1971, 23 years before the Crest Hollow CC&RS were recorded, and that I would not be taking any corrective action. I folded it, put it in an envelope addressed to the HOA's property management company, and drove it to the post office rather than the mailbox because I wanted a postmarked certified receipt. The receipt came back 11 days later, signed. I clipped it to the front of the notice. That was Notice 1. Notice 2 arrived 6 weeks later, carrying a fine of $400 and a threat to place a lien on the parcel if the violation was not cured within 30 days. The language had changed slightly. The word aesthetic had been replaced with community standards, and a new provision had been added to the cited list, one that referenced structures not conforming to the residential character of the development. I noted the language shift and filed it next to the first notice. Someone had been doing a little editing. I sent another certified letter, again citing the deed date, again referencing the state nursery license. And this time, I added a photocopy of my father's attorney memo from 1971. I got no substantive response. What I got instead was an HOA board resolution passed at the next monthly meeting, which I was not informed of and not invited to, stating that the Calhoun parcel was under review for compliance and that the board had directed staff to explore enforcement options. Bev Tanner, one of the board members, later told me she had voted against it and that Denise had run the meeting like a closing argument rather than a neighborhood discussion, presenting the parcel on a printed map and circling it in red marker. That was noticed too, and the fine count was at $400. The third step came on a Thursday afternoon in late September. A man in a polo shirt with a Crest Hollow HOA logo arrived at my fence line with a steel measuring tape, a clipboard, and a form on letterhead I did not recognize. He introduced himself as a compliance inspector. He was perhaps 30 years old, had a practiced official manner, and wore sunglasses he did not take off. I asked him which agency he was with, and he told me he was a certified HOA compliance inspector. When I asked him who had certified him, he looked at his clipboard and said the Community Property Standards Council. I asked him where that body was licensed in this state. He did not have an answer. I told him politely that he was welcome to stand on the public easement on the road side of the fence, but that he was not authorized to enter my property without my consent, and that I did not consent. He stood at the fence for another minute, measuring the distance from the gate post to my nearest bed, with the tape extended, recording a number I had no confidence was accurate. And then he made some notes and left in a white sedan with no markings. I went inside and ran a search that evening on the Community Property Standards Council. It was a trade association name with no state licensing, no enforcement authority, and a website that had been registered 14 months prior. Its mailing address was a mail forwarding service in another state. The organization had no listed officers, no published bylaws, and no presence in any state professional directory I could find. I printed the search results and put them in the folder. 3 days after the inspector's visit, Denise called me. She said her compliance inspector had documented 3 violations and that the HOA board had voted to add a $400 assessment to the file. I asked her the name of the state agency that had licensed the inspector. She said that was not relevant. I said it was very relevant, and that I had not consented to an inspection, and that the organization he claimed to represent had no licensing in this state. She said, "Mr. Calhoun, the Community Property Standards Council is a nationally recognized body," and her voice had gone from smooth to tight. I said I had checked, and it was not. She said the fines were assessed, and the matter would proceed. I told her to send the assessment by certified mail and ended the call. The fine count was now at $800. That was step 3. Step 4 was the cease and desist letter from a law firm. It arrived the first week of October, and it was well drafted, which told me this was Denise's husband, Marcus's network at work. Because Marcus Hartwell was a commercial real estate developer with a 3-county footprint and a regular client relationship with the firm that sent the letter. I had started looking into Marcus 3 weeks earlier, when I pulled on the thread of Bright Borders, the beautification contractor. Bright Borders LLC was a registered entity in this state. Its registered agent was a management company. Its sole member, listed in the original filing, was a holding company called HMG Properties. The managing member of HMG Properties was Marcus Hartwell. I found that record on a Tuesday evening, sitting at my kitchen table with a county business registry printout and a cup of coffee, Cody doing homework at the other end of the table under the kitchen light. And I remember that I set my coffee down and sat with the printout for a while without saying anything. The geometry of it was becoming clear. Denise ran the HOA. Denise approved the beautification contract. Bright Borders held the beautification contract. Marcus owned Bright Borders through a holding company. I filed the printout. The cease and desist demanded I remove the raised beds and all commercial signage within 15 days or face injunctive action. I forwarded it to Walt Pruitt, a retired county assessor I had known for 20 years, who had helped me with a boundary question some years back, and who still kept a small wholesale nursery on 12 acres outside town. Partly as a hobby and partly because he could not entirely stop working. Walt was 71 years old and moved slowly and knew more about deed history than anyone I had ever encountered. He read the letter and called me the next morning. He said what Denise and Marcus plainly did not understand was that an agricultural commercial use parcel grandfathered under a pre-HOA deed was not subject to CC&R enforcement under state property law, and that if they filed an injunction, they would lose, and they would lose in a way that created precedent they did not want on the books. He said he had seen this twice before in his career at the assessor's office, and both times the HOA had walked away with nothing but legal fees. He said he would be happy to put his analysis in writing over his signature and former county title. I told him I appreciated it and that I would keep the offer in reserve. That was step 4 on the staircase, and the fine count was at $2,400 across 6 months of notices. I want to tell you exactly what I was doing during those months, because it matters. I was not stewing. I was not lying awake running arguments through my head. Every escalation went into the folder. Every certified mail receipt came back and got clipped to its corresponding notice. The fine assessments were not paid, but they were tracked to the dollar, because I needed a clean record of refusal to establish the pattern of jurisdictional overreach. I had a conversation with Deputy Lena Cross at the county sheriff's substation in early November, because Denise had filed a complaint alleging I was operating an unlicensed commercial business in a residential zone. Lena was thorough and straightforward, and she told me flat that her office had to respond to filed complaints regardless of merit, that she had done a records check and found my nursery license current and my parcel-zoned agricultural commercial in the county database, and that in her professional view there was no violation to act on. She said that if Denise continued filing, the office would need to build a documented pattern to support any eventual enforcement or non-enforcement decision, and that a well-maintained file on my end would matter. She told me to keep my records current and to note every contact with specificity, date and time and name. I had already been doing that. I thanked her and drove home, and added the conversation to the folder with the time and her badge number. The thing about Glenwood Farm came to me in late November, the way useful information usually comes, which is sideways and by accident. I had driven out to pick up a shipment of bare root peonies from Walt's operation, a cold, clear morning with frost still on the grass, and we were standing in his pack shed drinking coffee from a thermos when he mentioned, almost as an aside, that he had been supplying Crest Hollow's beautification program for 6 years on a wholesale contract. He said he had been thinking about winding the operation down because his back was not cooperating with the lifting anymore, and that if I knew anyone who might be interested in the place, he would consider a fair offer. He said the beautification contract paid reasonably well, that Bright Borders took delivery from him each season and marked up the stock before billing the HOA. I asked him what the markup looked like. He said he had heard from the landscaper who did the installation that the billing to the HOA ran about 40% over his wholesale price. I set down my coffee cup. Walt looked at me the way old men look at you when they have said something and are waiting to see if you understood it. I understood it. I drove home and pulled the HOA's annual financial disclosure, which I had requested and received 2 months earlier. It was a public document under state HOA law, available on written request, and most people in Crest Hollow had never asked for it. The budget line for common area plantings was $68,000 for the most recent fiscal year. Walt's wholesale on a typical season's order was somewhere around $48,000. At a 40% markup, Bright Borders was billing roughly $67,000. Marcus Hartwell's holding company, through Bright Borders, had been collecting approximately $20,000 per year above wholesale from HOA dues paid by Crest Hollow residents, approved by Denise, who was his wife. I ran that back 6 years. $47,000, give or take. Every spring planting, every fall swap out, every gate bed refresh. The residents of Crest Hollow had been paying a premium that went directly to Marcus through a company name that disclosed nothing about who owned it. I sat at my kitchen table for a long time that night with the numbers spread out in front of me. The financial disclosure, Walt's rough invoicing records from the previous 2 seasons, the Bright Borders LLC filing, the HMG Properties registration, the Marcus Hartwell Property Development filings. It was all public record. None of it required anything except the willingness to request documents and read them. Cody came down for a glass of water around 10 and asked what I was working on. I told him property research. He said it looked serious. I said it was getting that way. He stood at the table a moment longer than usual, then took his water glass and went back upstairs. I called Walt the next morning and asked him whether he had any interest in selling Glenwood Farm. He went quiet for a moment, and then said he might, depending on the arrangement. We talked for 2 hours. By the end, I had the outlines of a purchase that would give Walt a fair price, a 1-year consulting arrangement that kept him involved at a level his back could manage, and an option that let him buy back the residential portion of the property if he ever wanted it. We shook on it over the phone and agreed to get a title company moving. I did not tell Denise. I did not tell Marcus. I did not mention it to anyone outside of my brother, who was holding my backup documents and who had the sense to keep quiet. Cody found out when I told him I was going to need him at the closing, and he looked at me for a second and then started to smile. And I shook my head, because we were not there yet. The 5th step, the one that crossed the line, happened in early March, a Saturday. I had taken Cody to the regional farmers market 2 counties over because he had been wanting to run a booth of his own as a school project, selling cuttings and seedlings. We left before 7 in the morning, the truck loaded, Pepper in the back seat, and we did not return until mid-afternoon. When we came down the drive and I saw the empty ground, it took a moment for my mind to organize what my eyes were telling it. 11 raised beds, built from 2-inch cedar my father had milled himself, some of them 20 years old, were gone. The soil had been turned out across the grass in long, dark furrows, and the lumber was stacked near the fence line, most of it loaded and hauled. But 2 beds had been broken apart rather than disassembled, and the pieces left in a rough pile. My perennial cutting rows, wintered over in 2 beds, the ranunculus corms and the allium bulbs, had been dug out and dumped loose on the ground. The irrigation lines were cut at the main junction, not disconnected. Cut with something blunt that had also scored the drip tubing. Pepper was in the barn, unharmed, locked in the back stall, which told me whoever did this had known the dog was there, and made a point of not injuring her while also making sure she could not raise any alarm from the road. There was a Bright Borders refrigerator magnet stuck to my gate post, the kind you drop at a trade show, shiny red with the company name and a phone number. They had apparently stuck it to prop the latch open, and then walked away, without thinking to take it with them. Cody stood beside me on the driveway, and did not say anything. I put my hand on his shoulder and told him to go get my phone from the truck. I took photographs of everything before I moved a single board. I walked the entire area in a grid and photographed every corner, the turned soil, the broken lumber, the cut irrigation lines, the dumped corms lying on the cold ground, the Bright Borders magnet on the gate post. Then I called Deputy Cross. She arrived within the hour, walked the area with me, photographed the magnet separately, bagged it, and wrote up the report citing criminal trespass and willful destruction of commercial property. She asked whether I had surveillance footage. I had 4 cameras on the property, 2 on the barn facing the road, and 2 covering the bed area. The footage from that morning showed a white flatbed truck arriving at 7:42. 2 men in bright borders polo shirts unloading hand trucks and pry bars, and the disassembly taking approximately 94 minutes. The truck's plates were readable in 4 separate frames. Deputy Cross watched the footage twice through, standing in my office without sitting down. And when it finished the second time, she said the trespass was clean and the property destruction count was supportable. She said the footage, the magnet, and the fine history already on file made for a complete documented record. She said she would be filing the report that evening and that the plates would be run that night. I assessed the damage at $12,400 for the beds themselves, the lost corms, the irrigation infrastructure, and the lost growing season on 2 perennial rows that would need to be restarted from scratch. I put that number in a certified letter to the HOA's property management company and sent it Monday morning. I did not hear back. What happened next, I did not plan as a dramatic sequence. It was just the result of work I had already set in motion. The closing on Glenwood Farm was the 2nd week of March, 10 days after the beds came down. I signed the purchase documents at the title company's office, Walt seated beside me and signing his side of the table, and I became the owner of the only wholesale nursery in the county that supplied seasonal plantings to Crest Hollow's beautification program. Walt looked tired but satisfied the way people look when a decision they have been weighing for years has finally been made for them. Cody shook his hand on the sidewalk outside. The following week, the Bright Borders landscaping coordinator called Walt's number to place the spring order, a standing arrangement worth $12,000 in annuals and perennial stock. Walt, still answering the farm's phone under our consulting arrangement, took down the order and told the coordinator the farm had changed ownership and the new owner would call back to confirm. I called back that afternoon. I told the coordinator that Glenwood Farm was no longer in a position to fulfill the Crest Hollow beautification contract, that I was providing 60 days written notice of termination as required under the supply agreement, and that the termination notice would go by certified mail to both Bright Borders and the HOA. The coordinator went very quiet. Then he asked whether I was serious. I said I was, and that I expected they would understand once the county attorney's office completed its review of the beautification billing records, which I had already sent to the county attorney's office, along with the Marcus Hartwell Business Registry printout and a 6-year reconstruction of the pricing differential between Walt's wholesale invoices and the Bright Borders billings to the HOA. He said nothing further. I thanked him and ended the call. The termination notice landed the same week Denise had scheduled a county planning board hearing on a petition she had filed to have my parcel's ag-use classification reviewed for rezoning. The hearing was a public proceeding. I had received notice of it 30 days prior, and had spent those 30 days getting every document in order. Bev Tanner called me the week before and told me that 2 of the other board members were uncomfortable with the petition, and that Denise had pressured them to sign on anyway. She said if I showed up with the right paperwork, the board might not need much persuading. I told Bev I would be there, and I thanked her for calling. The morning of the hearing, Cody drove with me. He wore a collared shirt and held the documentation binder I had asked him to carry, 87 pages by that point. Walt Pruitt was already seated in the gallery when we arrived, his hat in his hands, looking like a man who had been to many of these hearings and had learned patience. Deputy Cross was present in a procedural capacity at the back of the room. I took a seat at the respondents' table and set one folder in front of me. Just the one. The rest was with Cody. Denise presented her petition for about 15 minutes, She spoke about aesthetic incompatibility, residential character, community investment, and what she called the long-term vision for Crest Hollow as a cohesive planned development. She said the Calhoun parcel was an anomaly that disrupted property values and that the agricultural use classification was an anachronism that no longer served the community. She said it 3 times in 3 different phrasings. At one point, she gestured toward where I was sitting and said, "The residents of Crest Hollow did not invest in their homes to live adjacent to a commercial farming operation, and the board has a responsibility to protect that investment." She said it with the certainty of a woman who had been agreed with for a long time and had stopped checking whether she was right. She did not produce a single document and referred to the CC and RS only by summary. The board chair, a patient man named Gerald Oakes, who had the manner of a retired civil engineer and the attention span of someone who read fine print for pleasure, listened to all of it without expression, then turned to me. I opened the folder. The first document was the 1971 deed, my father's signature on the 3rd page, the agricultural commercial use designation printed clearly on the 1st page, the county recorder's stamp dated April 14th, 1971. I slid it to the clerk and asked her to enter it into the record. I told the board the parcel had carried that designation for 53 years without interruption, that the Crest Hollow CC and RS had been filed in 1994, 23 years after that date, and that, under state property law, an existing agricultural use classification predating an HOA's founding documents was not subject to the HOA's land use restrictions. I pulled out the nursery grower's license, current and uninterrupted for 18 years under my name and 11 years before that under my father's. I pulled out the county ag use tax exemption certificate. I pulled out my father's 1994 attorney memo, written specifically in anticipation of this argument, and signed by a licensed attorney whose bar number I had confirmed was still active. I placed each document in front of the clerk in order and did not say anything further. Gerald Oakes looked at the deed for about 20 seconds. He looked at the license. He looked at the memo. He took off his reading glasses and set them on the table. He asked Denise whether the HOA had reviewed these documents prior to filing the petition. She said she believed the ag use classification had lapsed. He asked when it had lapsed and on what basis. She said she had been advised it had lapsed. He asked who had advised her. She said the HOA's legal counsel. He asked whether legal counsel had pulled the county record. The room went quiet. I could hear the ventilation in the ceiling. Cody was 3 rows back in the gallery, and I did not turn to look at him. The silence ran about 4 seconds and felt like considerably more. Denise opened her mouth and closed it. Gerald put his glasses back on and made a note on the pad in front of him. He said the petition was denied on its face, the ag use classification clearly current and clearly predating the HOA's founding by 23 years, and that he was referring the prior fine assessments to the county's HOA Oversight Office for review, given the apparent jurisdictional defect in the original notices. He then said, in a measured voice that I had the feeling he had been saving for exactly this moment, that the board had also received a referral from the county attorney's office the previous day regarding a billing matter connected to the Crest Hollow beautification program, and that he wanted the record to reflect that no member of this board had any knowledge of or participation in that arrangement. He said it carefully and looked at Denise when he said it. Denise stood up. She said there must be some misunderstanding. Gerald said the county attorney would be the one to sort out what was understood and what wasn't. The county attorney's review ran 4 months. Marcus Hartwell's holding company had collected $47,000 in markup on beautification billings over 6 years, funds drawn from resident dues and approved by Denise in her capacity as president. She had signed off on every payment cycle. The county attorney found sufficient basis to refer the matter to the state HOA Regulatory Board for a formal audit, and to the district attorney for review under the self-dealing provisions of state nonprofit law. Local news ran the story for 2 days, which I had not anticipated and did not seek. Marcus and Denise retained separate counsel within the week. Denise resigned the HOA presidency by letter in May, citing personal reasons. The board appointed Bev Tanner as interim president. And the first thing Bev did was formally rescind all 6 fine notices, totaling $6,800, and authorize payment to me of $12,400 for the destroyed beds and associated losses. The check came by certified mail. It cleared in June. The Crest Hollow beautification contract moved to a wholesale nursery across the county line. That was their choice, and it was the right one. I had the farm to run, and I was not interested in supplying flowers to people who had just had their board investigated. With Glenwood's 4 additional greenhouse bays integrated into my operation, I had the production capacity I had been wanting for 2 years. Cody ran the Saturday market booth through the spring and into early summer and made enough to buy a second-hand truck of his own. He was deeply proud of it. I let him be. That fall, on a Saturday morning in October, I found him in the old greenhouse before sunrise, grating a flat of late dahlias, the radio low, Pepper at the doorway. He looked up when I came in and said the ranunculus corms in the 3rd row of the rebuilt beds were showing strong growth. I told him I knew. He went back to work. I stood there a minute in the cold greenhouse light, looking at the rebuilt beds through the glass, 11 of them back in their rows on the south-facing slope, the cedar new and pale where the old timber had been. My father had built the first ones from the same stand of trees. My son was grading stems in my father's greenhouse before sunrise on a Saturday. I thought about the metal cabinet in the barn, and the folder labeled for when this happens, and how the date on a deed is just a number until someone comes for the land, and you have to show them what that number means. Then I poured a cup of coffee from the thermos and got to work. Here is what I want you to take away from this. Go pull your deed. Not the summary, not the title company's cover letter. The actual recorded instrument with the county recorder's stamp on it. Find the date it was filed. If your property carries any prior use classification, agricultural, commercial, historical, industrial, find the date the classification was established and compare it to the date your HOA's founding documents were recorded. If your use predates the HOA's founding, the CC and ours cannot reach it in most states, but you will need that original recorded deed to prove it. Then check whether any contractor or service provider billing through your HOA has an ownership connection to anyone on the board or their immediate family. That information is in the HOA's annual financial disclosure, which is a public document in most states. Request it in writing. Read every line. If the numbers do not line up, take them to your county attorney's office and let trained people look at them. You do not need to confront anyone. You need records and the right address on an envelope. If you have dealt with an HOA that reached past its authority, I want to hear about it. Drop it in the comments and tell me how it went. If you are sitting with a binder and waiting for the right moment, subscribe and come back next week. I have a story about a combat engineer who inherited a private road easement that an HOA tried to absorb into their walking path system, and the State Transportation Board letter that ended the argument in one afternoon. That one is worth the wait. Thank you for being here.